November 14th, 1940. Thursday evening. The smell of boiled cabbage still hung in the air when Mum told me to fetch my sister from Mrs. Patterson's across Warwick Road. I didn't want to go. It was cold outside, and the blackout curtains made our little kitchen feel like a cave I didn't want to leave. But Mum had that look, the one that said arguing would cost me more than just stepping into the November chill. I was 9 years old. My name is Thomas Whitley, and I lived at number 42 Spawn Street, Coventry, in a narrow brick terraced house that smelled like coal smoke and my father's pipe tobacco. Except Dad wasn't there anymore. He'd been gone since May, somewhere in France with the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. Mum kept his letters in a biscuit tin under her bed. She read them at night when she thought I was asleep. I pulled on my wool coat, the gray one with the missing button Mum kept promising to fix, and stepped out into the street. The cold hit my face like a slap. Frost already glittered on the cobblestones, and my breath came out in clouds that vanished as soon as they appeared. Coventry at night was a strange, darkened place. No street lamps, no light bleeding from windows, just shapes and shadows and the sound of your own footsteps echoing off brick walls. I knew every crack in the pavement, every lamppost, every alley between the houses. I could walk to Mrs. Patterson's with my eyes closed. But tonight felt different. I couldn't explain it then. Maybe it was the silence. Usually, you'd hear something, a wireless playing through a wall, someone coughing, a baby crying. But tonight, the street felt hollow, empty, like the city was holding its breath. I crossed Warwick Road, careful to avoid the puddle near the curb that never dried. Mrs. Patterson's house sat 3 doors down, identical to ours except for the crack that ran up the left side of her doorframe. I knocked twice. "Come in, love," Mrs. Patterson's voice called from inside. The door creaked open. Inside, it was warm. A coal fire burned in the grate, casting orange light across faded wallpaper covered in tiny roses. My sister Annie sat on the rug near the fire, clutching her cloth doll, the one she called Margaret. Annie was 6, with blonde hair that never stayed in its ribbons and a gap between her front teeth she liked to whistle through. "Mum says you've got to come home now," I told her. Annie looked up at me with those big blue eyes. But Mrs. Patterson was going to tell me about the fairies in her garden. "There's no fairies in November, Annie." Mrs. Patterson smiled from her armchair. She was old, at least 60, maybe more, with white hair pinned up in a bun and hands that shook when she poured tea. "Your brother's right, dear. Time for you both to get home. Your mum will be worrying." Annie stood slowly, dragging her feet. She held Margaret against her chest like a shield. "Say thank you to Mrs. Patterson," I reminded her. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. You're welcome, sweet girl. Now, off with you both." We stepped back into the cold. Annie's hand found mine, small and warm. We walked in silence for a moment, our shoes scraping against the cobblestones. "Thomas? Yeah? Do you think Dad's cold where he is?" I didn't know what to say. I'd wondered the same thing myself, lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling. I'd tried to imagine what France looked like, what kind of food he ate, whether he thought about us the way we thought about him. "He's got his coat," I said finally, "and his mates to keep him company. I miss him." "Me too." We reached our door. I pushed it open, and the warmth from the kitchen fire rushed out to meet us. Mum was at the stove, stirring something in a pot. She turned when she heard us. "Good lad, Thomas. Annie, wash your hands. Supper's nearly ready." I hung my coat on the hook by the door. My fingers tingled as they warmed. Annie ran to the basin, standing on her tiptoes to reach the tap. It was just another Thursday evening. Supper, bed. Maybe Mum would read us a story, if we were lucky. Tomorrow, I'd go to school, and Annie would play with Margaret in the back garden. Life went on, even with Dad gone, even with the war. But then I heard it. A sound, faint at first, like distant thunder, except it wasn't thunder. It was too steady, too rhythmic. Mum heard it too. She stopped stirring. Her hand froze mid-motion, and her head tilted slightly, listening. The sound grew louder, a droning hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Thomas," Mum said quietly, "take Annie to the shelter. Now." "But Mum." "Now, Thomas." Her voice wasn't angry, it was something else. Something that made my stomach twist. The air raid siren started wailing. The siren was the worst sound I'd ever heard. It started low, then rose higher and higher, until it felt like it was inside your skull, clawing at your brain. Annie clapped her hands over her ears and squeezed her eyes shut. "Come on." I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back door. Our shelter was in the garden, an Anderson shelter, they called it. Dad and Mr. Henley from next door had dug it into the ground back in '39, a curved tunnel of corrugated steel covered with sandbags and earth. The entrance was just a hole in the ground, with wooden steps leading down into darkness. Mum was right behind us, carrying a blanket and the torch. She'd stuffed a loaf of bread under her arm. "If you go, quickly." I went first, feeling my way down the steps. The shelter smelled like damp earth and rust. It was freezing inside, colder than outside. My breath fogged in the beam of Mum's torch as she followed us down. Annie was crying. Not loud sobs, just quiet whimpering as she clutched Margaret. "It's all right, love," Mum said, wrapping the blanket around both of us. "We're safe down here." We sat on the wooden bench Dad had built along one wall. Mum turned off the torch to save the battery. Darkness swallowed us whole. The droning overhead grew louder. I could feel it now, vibrating through the earth, through the metal walls, through my chest. It sounded like hundreds of bees, massive and angry. "What is it?" Annie whispered. "Aeroplanes," I said. "German aeroplanes?" "Yeah." "Why are they here?" I didn't know how to answer that. I knew about the war, everyone did. I'd seen the newsreels at the cinema and heard the wireless reports. But knowing something and experiencing it were different things entirely. Mum's voice was steady in the darkness. "They'll drop their bombs and go home. We'll be fine. Just close your eyes," and the first explosion cut her off. It wasn't like in the films. It didn't sound distant or muffled. It was sharp and immediate, a crack that split the air like lightning, followed by a deep boom that shook the ground beneath us. Dirt rained down from the ceiling. Annie screamed. "It's all right. It's all right." Mum kept saying, pulling us closer. "We're safe. We're safe." But we weren't safe. I knew it, even if I couldn't say it. The bombs kept coming, one after another, some distant, some so close I could feel the heat through the metal walls. The ground shook with each impact. The air smelled like burning. I lost track of time. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like forever. Between the explosions, I could hear other sounds. The crackle of flames, the crash of falling masonry. Somewhere, someone was screaming. And beneath it all, that endless droning of the aeroplanes circling overhead like metal vultures. Annie had stopped crying. She sat very still, very quiet, her face pressed against Mum's shoulder. I wondered if she was praying. Mum had taught us prayers, but I couldn't remember them now. My mind was blank except for the counting one explosion, 2, 3, 4, trying to track how many, where they landed, how close. Then came the sound that changed everything. A whistle. High-pitched and descending, growing louder and louder. "Down!" Mum screamed. She threw herself over us, pressing us against the bench. I squeezed my eyes shut and waited for the end. The explosion hit so close the metal walls buckled inward. The blast wave punched through the shelter like a fist. My ears popped. Pain lanced through my head. I couldn't hear anything except a high, thin ringing. When I opened my eyes, dust filled the air so thick I couldn't see. I tried to breathe and choked. My lungs burned. "Mum?" My voice sounded strange, distant. "Mum, I'm here." Her hand found mine in the darkness. "Are you hurt?" "I don't think so." "Annie?" Annie coughed. "Margaret's gone." "What?" "The explosion. She fell. I can't find her." "We'll find her later," Mum said. "Right now we just need to—" Another explosion. Closer, this time. The shelter tilted. Sandbags slid down the walls. The wooden steps collapsed. "We can't stay here," I said. "The shelter's falling apart. It's safer than outside." "Mum, look!" A crack had opened in the metal wall. Through it, I could see an orange light. Fire. The house next door, Mr. Henley's house, was burning. Mum stared at the crack, her face illuminated by the flickering glow. I saw something in her expression I'd never seen before. Fear. Real, raw fear. "Up," she said. "We're going up." The steps were gone, but the hole was still there. Mum boosted Annie up first, then me. I grabbed the edge of the opening and pulled myself into the garden. I wish I hadn't. The sky was on fire. That's what it looked like. Not just flames from burning buildings, but the sky itself, orange and red and yellow, swirling with black smoke that blocked out the stars. The droning had stopped, but now there was something worse. The roar of fire, the crash of collapsing walls, the pop and crack of wood burning. Our house was still standing, but Mr. Henley's was an inferno. Flames poured from every window, reaching up into the smoke like grasping hands. The heat hit my face like standing too close to an oven. "Don't look," Mum said, climbing up behind us. "Just move." "Where?" "Where?" "The public shelter. On Ford Street." That was 6 streets away. Through the burning city. Through whatever hell had been unleashed. But what choice did we have? Mum took Annie's hand. I followed close behind. We ran through the back gate into the alley, our shoes crunching on broken glass. The cobblestones were littered with debris roof tiles, bricks, chunks of plaster. A door lay in the middle of the alley, torn from its hinges. We turned onto Spawn Street. I stopped. The street I'd walked down an hour ago, the street I knew better than my own hand, was gone. Not damaged. Gone. Every house on the left side had collapsed into rubble. Smoke poured from the ruins. A woman stood in the street, screaming a name over and over. Blood ran down her face. "Don't stop," Mum said, pulling me forward. "Keep moving." We ran past the woman, past an old man sitting on the curb with his head in his hands, past a dog that limped by, whimpering, its fur singed. The fire was everywhere, not just in buildings, but in the street itself. Something had ruptured a gas main. Maybe, and flames shot up through a crack in the cobblestones like a dragon's breath. Annie was sobbing again. "I want Dad. I want Dad." "I know, love. I know." We turned onto Little Park Street. Here, the damage was lighter. Some houses still had windows. Some chimneys still stood. But the fire was spreading. I could see it creeping from roof to roof, jumping across alleys, consuming everything. People ran past us in both directions, some heading toward the public shelters. Others were just running, panicked, directionless. A man in an ARP helmet shouted at us to take cover. An ambulance screamed past, bell clanging. "How much farther?" I asked. "2 more streets." We turned a corner and nearly collided with a group of firefighters dragging a hose. They weren't fighting the fire, they were just trying to stop it from spreading. One of them, a young man with a soot-blackened face, saw us. "Get to a shelter," he shouted. Ford Street shelters still. An explosion cut him off. Not a bomb this time. Something else. An incendiary, maybe, or a gas explosion. A building half a block away erupted in flames so bright I had to shield my eyes. The force of the blast knocked me off my feet. I hit the cobblestones hard, scraping my hands. My ears rang. Everything sounded muffled, distant. Hands grabbed me. Mum, pulling me up. "Can you walk?" I nodded, even though my head was spinning. Then, "Move." We ran, past the burning building, past a crater in the street where a bomb had hit, past a tram that sat on its side, windows shattered, empty. And then we saw it. The cathedral. Coventry Cathedral sat in the city center, its spire reaching toward heaven, a landmark I'd seen every day of my life. Dad had taken me there once, when I was small. We climbed the tower and looked out over the whole city. It had seemed so big, so permanent, so unmovable. Now it was dying. Flames consumed it. The roof was gone, just a skeleton of burning timbers. The windows, those beautiful stained glass windows, had shattered. Fire poured from every opening, turning the stone walls red-orange in the night. "Oh, God," Mum whispered. "Oh, God." Annie stared at it, her mouth open. "Is God's house burning?" No one answered. We stood there for just a moment, watching something that had stood for centuries being destroyed in hours, watching the heart of our city torn out. Then Mum squeezed my hand. "Come on." Ford Street was ahead. The public shelter entrance was a concrete bunker, half buried in the ground. People crowded around it, pushing, shoving, desperate to get inside. We joined them. The shelter was packed. Bodies pressed against bodies in the dim light of a few electric bulbs. The air was thick and hot and smelled like sweat and dim, fear and urine. Someone had been sick in the corner. A baby was crying. We found a space against the back wall and sank down. My legs shook. I hadn't realized how much I'd been running until I stopped. All around us, people sat in small groups, quiet, shell-shocked. An elderly woman clutched a bird cage with an empty bird inside. It wasn't moving. A man in a torn suit jacket held a briefcase on his lap like it was the most precious thing in the world. Children huddled against their parents, eyes wide and frightened. The walls shook with each explosion above. Dust fell from the ceiling. The lights flickered. "How long do you think it'll last?" I asked Mum. She didn't answer. She just pulled Annie closer and stared at the concrete wall. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The explosions continued, relentlessly. Sometimes they were distant, just a rumble. Sometimes they were close enough to make the whole shelter shake. A man near the entrance kept track. "That's the gasworks," he'd say. Or, "That's near the canal." Or, "Christ, that's Hill Street. Hill Street, where my school was." I wondered if the school was still standing. I wondered if my desk, the one with my initials carved in the corner, was buried under rubble. I wondered if any of this would still be here when morning came. If morning came. Annie fell asleep against Mum's shoulder, exhausted. I was tired too, bone-tired, but every time I closed my eyes I saw flames, heard screams. I felt the ground shake. The woman next to us spoke suddenly. I left my Herald on the mantelpiece. I looked at her. She was middle-aged, with gray hair, and a cardigan buttoned wrong. "My son's picture," she continued. "From when he graduated. I grabbed my coat and my shoes, but I left Herald." What kind of mother leaves her son's picture? "You'll get it tomorrow," Mum said gently. "If there's a tomorrow. There'll be a tomorrow." But even Mum didn't sound convinced. Around midnight, or what I thought was midnight, a warden came down into the shelter. He was covered in soot and ash, his face streaked with sweat. "Anyone here with first aid training? We need help topside." A few people volunteered. A nurse, a street, John's ambulance man. They followed the warden up into the hell above. I don't know what they saw. I don't know what they did. But when they came back 2 hours later, their faces were blank. Empty. Like they'd seen something that broke them inside and they were still trying to understand what it was. The night stretched on, endless, eternal. At some point I dozed off. When I woke, Annie was awake too, staring at nothing. "You all right?" I whispered. She nodded. But she wasn't all right. None of us were. The explosions had stopped. I realized it suddenly, the silence. No droning overhead, no crashes, no explosions. Just the crackle of distant fires and the sound of people breathing in the darkness. "Is it over?" someone asked. No one answered, at first. Then the warden appeared again, climbing down into the shelter. His face was gray with ash. "The all clear sounded," he said. "They've gone." A collective exhale filled the shelter, relief so thick you could taste it. But don't go home yet, the warden continued. The fires are still burning, half the city's rubble. Watch where you step. And if you see unexploded ordnance, don't touch it. Report it. People started to move, slowly, carefully. Families gathered their things. The old woman with the empty birdcage stood and walked toward the exit, clutching it to her chest. Mum looked at me, then at Annie. Ready? I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. We climbed the steps back into the world. Dawn was breaking when we emerged. The sky was gray, choked with smoke. The sun was just a pale disk behind the haze, struggling to break through. Coventry was gone. Not entirely. Some buildings still stood. Some streets were still recognizable. But the city I'd known, the city I'd grown up in, had been erased. Rubble covered everything. Mountains of brick and stone and timber where houses used to be. Streets blocked by collapsed walls. Telegraph poles snapped in half, wires hanging loose. A car lay upside down in the middle of the road, burned black. The fires still burned, smaller now, but persistent. Smoke poured from ruins, rising into the gray sky. We walked in silence. There was nothing to say. When we turned onto Spawn Street, what was left of Spawn Street, my heart sank. Our house was standing, barely. The roof was gone, and one wall had collapsed, but the basic structure remained. Mr. Henley's house next door was nothing but a blackened skeleton. Stay here, Mum said. She climbed through the rubble into what used to be our front room. I looked around. The street was full of people, neighbors, strangers, all wandering through the ruins, looking for something, anything. A photograph, a piece of jewelry, proof that their lives had been real. Mrs. Patterson's house was gone. Just a pile of bricks where it used to stand. I wondered if she'd been in her shelter. I wondered if she'd survived. Annie tugged on my sleeve. Thomas. Yeah? Where's Margaret? In the shelter, remember? She fell when the bomb hit. Can we get her? I looked toward the back garden. The Anderson shelter was half collapsed, buried under debris from our house and Mr. Henley's. Maybe later, I said. Mum emerged from the house carrying Dad's biscuit tin, the one with his letters. She held it against her chest like it was made of gold. We can't stay here, she said. The walls aren't stable. We'll go to the rest center on Greyfriars Road. They'll have food and blankets. What about our things? What things, Thomas? Look around. There's nothing left. She was right. Everything we owned, our furniture, our clothes, my books, Annie's toys, was either buried under rubble or burned to ash. We walked through the city toward Greyfriars Road. All around us, people were after 40 City, doing the same. A long, silent procession of survivors, moving through the ruins. I saw things I couldn't process. A woman sitting in the rubble of her home, calmly pouring tea from a cracked pot into a cup with no handle. A man carrying a wardrobe on his back, refusing to leave it behind. A child's shoe lying in the middle of the street, one buckle still fastened, and bodies, covered with sheets, laid out in rows. I tried not to look, but I couldn't help it. I counted them as we passed. 10, 20, 30. I stopped counting. The rest center was overwhelmed. Hundreds of people crowded into what used to be a church hall. Volunteers handed out tea and bread. Women from the WVS tried to keep order, taking names, recording addresses. We found a spot on the floor and sat. Mum clutched the biscuit tin. Annie leaned against me. What happens now? I asked. Mum didn't answer right away. She stared at the tin in her hands, at the letters from Dad inside. Finally, she said, "We survive. That's what happens now. We survive." A volunteer brought us tea. It was weak and lukewarm, but I drank it anyway. It was something normal in a world that had become unrecognizable. Around us, people told their stories. Where they'd been when the raid started, how they'd survived, who they'd lost. An old man talked about seeing the cathedral burn. 600 years, he kept saying. 600 years, and they destroyed it in a night. A young woman cried quietly, rocking back and forth. She'd lost her husband. He'd been an ARP warden out in the streets when the bombs fell. A boy about my age sat against the wall, staring at nothing. His hands were wrapped in bandages. I wondered what he'd seen, what he'd done, whether he'd tried to dig someone out of the rubble. The day wore on. More survivors arrived. More stories. More grief. At some point, Annie fell asleep again. Mum pulled her onto her lap, stroked her hair. I sat and watched the people around us, all carrying their own wounds, visible and invisible. Thomas, Mum said quietly, when this is over, when the war's over, you're going to remember this. Remember everything. And it's going to hurt, but you need to remember. Do you understand? I nodded, even though I didn't really understand. Not then. Why? Because if we don't remember, if we forget what this felt like, then it can happen again, and we can't let it happen again. She was crying now, silent tears running down her soot-stained face. I reached out and took her hand. It was small and cold, and it trembled in mine. We'll survive, I said, repeating her words back to her. That's what happens now. We survive. She nodded and squeezed my hand. Outside, the smoke continued to rise from the ruins of Coventry. The city that had stood for 1,000 years reduced to rubble in 11 hours. 568 people died. Thousands were injured. 60,000 buildings destroyed or damaged. But we survived. I survived. And now, 85 years later, I'm telling you this story. Because someone needs to remember. Someone needs to bear witness to what happened that night. To the fear, the loss, the courage, the endurance. The sky fell on November 14th, 1940, but when morning came, we were still standing. Broken, yes. Changed, forever, yes. But standing. And that has to mean something.